Welcome for day 2. Me and Roy have done many conventions all over the place. I'm usually the makeshift guy if the announcer and stuff doesn't show him. But so we've done this. Hello, Mr. Roy Thomas. Everybody, Roy Thomas.
Right away, how many of you were here, heard one of the speeches yesterday? So we'll try to avoid as much as possible. My wife has heard some of these stories before. I will. They can hear me well enough without it.
Well, a really funny story for when we're talking about the little police incident out there. I always want to fashion myself after Roy's friend from many years ago. His name was Rocky, and have I earned my stripes yet, Roy?
Yeah, you're getting there. Have you been to reform school or prison yet?
Not yet.
That was the
Getting there, I'm trying. Earning my stripes. So, okay, this is about Roy. We're gonna first. I know yesterday they talked. Well, I wasn't here. I missed that. But we're talking about more of the Roy, the Robert E. Howard stuff. We're gonna delve now into Roy's career, just his beginnings, how he started, and then we'll take questions of whatever you want that will that Roy can answer, because he can answer anything. And I'll try to keep his answers a little bit short so we can get as many as we can. Is that good?
Lots of luck with that.
Right. That's right. All right, Roy. Roy, use the microphone.
Yeah.
Growing up, where'd you grow up, Roy?
Jackson, Missouri. It's a small town about 10 or 20 miles from the Mississippi. The largest town near it where I went to college, Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Have you ever heard of that? It's about 100 miles south of St. Louis and about 150 or so miles north of Memphis. So I spent a lot of time in St. Louis and taught there years later. But Jackson, Missouri was a small town of about, 4,000 or 5,000 people when I was growing up, 15 or 5, 6 at the most. Now it's about 15 or 20.
And your first, the first time that you ever witnessed a comic book or something?
I don't remember, but my late mother told me that when I was no older than 4, maybe young, but certainly no older, that I saw them at this local Jones drugstore, which is still there. No comics anymore, of course, but the store is still there. And I saw something, said that, it was some colorful thing, probably Superman or Batman or maybe Captain Marvel. I said, I want that or something. And my parents had, very little money, but they could scrape together an occasional dime. So my mother would buy me the comics, and and she would read them to me for the first few months. But I very quickly learned to read myself. No kindergarten in those days, so I had to learn to read before I was in the first grade. But before that, she read the stories to me, in particular Batman and Robin, things like that.
And it's funny, Roy is a part of history as Stanley and Jack Kirby are, because he's very humble to say this, but he had a different way of entering into comics, because first he was one of the first original fanboys with Jerry Bales and Billy Joe White. And Roy, what was the magazine that you guys started?
I don't remember. Actually, at the turn of 1961, Jerry Bales, who was a young, about 6, 7 years older than me, he was like at that age 25, 26, 27. He was from Missouri too, from Kansas City, Missouri, but he had moved to Detroit and he was a professor of natural science. I never figured out what the heck that was, but he was one at Wayne State University. And his hobby, he just liked comics, and he had his favorite comic and mine, as it turned out, were the same, which was All-Star Comics, which was the original group comic, the Justice Society of America, Green Lantern, Flash, Wonder Woman, occasionally Superman or Batman and so forth, the forerunner of Justice League. And so when I was writing letters to the editor of Justice League when it started out, Flash, Green Lantern and so forth, Julius Schwartz, who by the way, had once been an agent for H.P. Lovecraft, sold some of Lovecraft stories. Julie turned me over, said, if you want to know about All-Star Comics, you should write to Gardner Fox, the guy who was writing comics like The Atom and Hawkman and Justice League, because he wrote the first bunch of All-Stars way back in the 40s, and they had no credit, so I had no way of knowing that. And he said, and I wrote to Gardner right away just as I was turning 20, and Gardner sent me on to Jerry, who had just bought his collection of All-Star comics bound about 6 months before, after pestering him for years. I wanted to buy them. Of course, I would have had no money anyway, but to do it. But anyway, so he sent me Jerry's address. So within a couple of days, I was sending off a letter to Jerry. A few days later, by the time of my 20th birthday, Jerry sent me back 3 extra issues, some complete, some not, of All-Star Comics, which kind of, cemented your friendship. If I'd saved those, they're worth a few $1,000 now, but, if I had saved that giveaway thing. And he decided to start a newsletter to support the Justice League. It was going to be called the JLA Newsletter. But then he went to New York. He got a chance to go to New York to lecture at a college there. As he was doing this, by sheer coincidence, and he stopped by the DC office and met these people, and he saw a fanzine, a science fiction fanzine, which probably none of you ever heard, but it was really, really important. It was called Zero, with an X. And it was really covered about everything. It was a wonderful magazine published by Dick Lupoff, who became a science fiction writer later on. And it had a series in it. They made a book title out of it, All in Color for a Dime. It was a nostalgic thing about old comics. And that formed, Jerry decided he didn't want to do a newsletter anymore. He wanted to do a magazine, on a spirit duplicator. So he made up this name with a hyphen, Alter Ego, which is, of course, what they call the secret identity of the heroes. And he asked me to be co-editor, which just meant I wrote the half of the issue that he didn't write, and I did some cartoons and things like that. And that's where it started. It became one of the, not the very first fanzine, but the first real superhero fanzine and the first of a new wave of real comics fanzines as opposed to Zero and the science fiction. We stole everything from science fiction fandom, all the terminology, but it became a separate comic fandom that never looked back after 1961.
And that started spurring up a lot of these other fanzines and a lot of these new age fans and stuff. And I know Roy's very humble and stuff, but
I'm famous for it.
yeah, famous for it. But all these groups that you see today that like do comic conventions, it all kind of started with him. He's one of the roots in that. So that's why I think it's fascinating about Roy's story into comics, because he came in from the fan side of it while loving this stuff and then actually coming into it and rising to where he did. And I think sometimes Roy, I kind of can see it more than Roy can, but like he's that guy that brought in that literature base and then that fanboy enthusiasm in the writing that wasn't seen before, not to that level. And proof is in the pudding, because he knew, stemming to Conan and a lot of those other literature books and stuff, he's the guy that kind of saw that, because I don't think Stan Lee would have ever saw that. Roy?
Well, Stan was as I mentioned before, Stan was the guy as much as more than I was. He was reading all the mail, and the readers were writing in, get Conan or license one of these characters. But the only difference was he didn't understand. He never would read a story, and so forth about it. So he knew vaguely, he'd seen a couple of covers, and that was about it. But I had read a little bit of it, and I had the Conan books and a few of the others, even if I hadn't read too much of it. By that stage, I was starting to read it and discover that I liked, didn't care much for sword and sorcery fiction per se, but I liked Robert E. Howard's writing. And so, we ended up getting the rights, and as I said last time, we were trying for another character, and we stumbled into getting Conan, which is what we would have always wanted, but didn't think we could get. And it worked out well for us, and worked out well for Marvel, and for Conan, and quite a few other people along the way.
And it was always fascinating to me when I was a kid. Like, I always called Roy's writing sophisticated Stan, because when I was young, I didn't like it. It was always boring to me. But when I loved the Stan stuff. But as I got older, he had a lot of those isms in there that Stan did, but then it was a lot deeper. Stan was very surface. And then when I was reading Roy's, I was like, oh my God, that's what that is, and that's what that is. And then when I talk to him and he tells me the stuff that he got it from, there's just levels to it, and I find that very interesting. And
I swipe from the best. Shakespeare, but so does Stan, really.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a flow. And then I could understand what Stan saw in Roy. And what is interesting is they're a lot more alike than you think. Yeah, Roy is humble and Stan was more of the showman. But when you get to know Roy, I mean, like, he's quick. He has the quick wit and stuff that it makes me laugh and all. So I could understand why Stan liked him and wanted him around, and not to mention the skill he had.
And he did hire me 15 minutes after we met, so it's not too bad enough to make a good impression on him. By that time, he'd already read something that I had written and so forth, but he never did a writer's test, but he never discussed it with me. To this day, I've never seen that writer's test again, or heard one word, did I ever hear one word from him about what was in it, but he must have liked it enough to want to have me come over from my job at DC Comics, which is where I had come to work to New York to work at as the assistant editor on the Superman. You know, back then Superman had a comic, and Superboy, and Crypto the Superdog, I think, had a comic even. You know?
But to attest to his fanboyism, when you first saw John working in there with Marvel, and you first saw Johnny Romita, what did you say to him?
Well, the first thing, yeah, John Romita had been with, was coming back to work. He'd been working there in the 40s and 50s, and then he, you know, when the whole company kind of collapsed in the late 50s, he'd gone to work and was drawing DC romance comics, and nobody ever heard of him there. They never had him do any superheroes. They didn't know he'd ever done any, because these other DC editors, there's 6 or 7, they didn't talk to each other, they didn't know anything except their own books. And so I'm sitting there at my little corrugated metal desk, and this artist about 10 years older, I'm 24, 25, he's, you know, about 10 years older, and he comes in, and the production manager introduces me to him and says, oh, this is a person who used to work here, is going to come back, work here, his name is John Romita. And I said, you drew Captain America. And this had been like, what, 10 or 15 years before that he had done Captain America in 54. And he just about passed out, you know, because he said he had, in all those years, he had never heard anybody mention Captain America to him. He had no idea that nobody knew anything he did, let alone particular issues and so forth. And, you know, it's to surprise people. I don't like the term fanboy, but, you know, I can't deny it. You know, if somebody wants to call me that, there's worse things. I've been called worse, house Roy, fanboy, you know, and many other things I can't mention here.
But that just shows you, like, where the mentality of what the bullpen and the comic people are at. They were just, a lot of them, they liked the comics, but they were just kind of working. Roy comes in there with this fresh, exuberant attitude and loving this stuff, and then showing that to Johnny Romita, saying that he can't even believe it. And then comes the slew of the other guys coming in after you, like Marv Wolfman, Len Wein, who are all coming from the fantasy too.
Same kind of mold as I was.
Yeah.
And you know, many of them, first thing, this was like, not that it's a big deal, but and it certainly would be now, but at that time it was, we were some of the first people coming in, not the first, but you know, in a sort of a minor wave over those next years, from 65 to 70 or so, that were either, you know, college educated or partly college educated. You know, Marv Wolfman had been an art teacher briefly. You know, a few other people were there. I got Denny O'Neill in there. He had been educated and had been a newspaper reporter, and he had a graduate degree from St. Louis University in literature and various things, and you know, and like that. So you know, it sort of changed things. And I think one of the reasons Stan liked to hire us, because you know, a guy who, growing up in the Depression, you know, coming of age in the Depression, he wasn't able to go to college. You know, his parents, he had no money. He had to go to work as a, you know, a very young age, you know, and so forth. It just so happened that by 19 he was the head of one of the largest comics companies in the country, but that was just an accident of birth.
And okay, so then comes the new age, and then Roy ascends to unbelievable heights, where Roy is picked as Stan's successor. Can you talk about that, Roy?
Well,
on the day of my birth.
I never thought of it as unbelievable. Well, you know, I had to give you something, John. But, well, was it really what they said?
Oh, no. You started, 72. I was born in 73, where you were at the height of your power.
Yeah, I peaked. That's about 50 years ago, something like that. This is you know, the descent. But, yeah, I didn't ever think about this, because I believe that Stan Lee was, you know, first of all, he was about 18 years older than me, but he looked, you know, at that time when I went to work for him, he's only in his early 40s, so I figured he'd go on forever as the editor of Marvel Comics. He was related twice, actually, in 2 different ways, by marriage to the publisher, which is how he originally got his job. But he also was very, you know, capable as a writer, as an editor, and so forth, so I figured he'd be there forever, and where was he going to go unless, he went to DC or somewhere. So I just was content to forever be his, you know, second banana, not a bad position to be, you know, somebody whose work you know, basically respect and so forth. And then he did something that, you know, I wouldn't have believed, which is he somehow, because he didn't like working under the son of the original publisher, he got himself kicked up, he intrigued with the new conglomerate that had purchased the company a few years earlier, and got himself kicked upstairs to be the president and publisher of Marvel. just so he wouldn't have to take orders from the publisher's son, really, as much as anything, I think. And Marvel got made a separate company then, and so forth. And then we had to terribly expand because he came in and says, well, we got to expand now. We're a separate company. We have to have our own controller. We have to have this. We have to have that. So we got to have like twice as many books practically overnight. I thought maybe a raise would go with some of this, but it did come about eventually. It took a while, But it was still a challenge, especially 72 was fun because I did get my editor-in-chief job and title in an interesting way, which is kind of funny.
Tell them, tell them the title.
Stan didn't want to give up power. He'd been the whole, if you see the old press from the 40s, it says Stan Lee, editorial and art director. Now, Stan couldn't draw flies, but, neither can I, but he wanted to be art director, and it really fit because he really knew art. He knew what to tell artists how to do, how to be exciting, how to do this. This arm's too long. Other DC editors couldn't have begun. Julie Schwartz wouldn't have known how many fingers somebody had in the art. He was a story man who knew nothing about the art, and he said so many times, and he was right. But Stan really knew what was good about the art, even though he himself was not an artist, and editorially, of course, there was no reason to not. He was a good writer, and he had a natural editorial bent, and he wanted to keep that title. He wasn't going to keep it exactly, but he didn't want anybody else to have it either. So he divided it up into a triumvirate. Now, I don't know if you've ever read Julius Caesar, say, by Shakespeare, but triumvirates are not the most stable forms of ruling. Always, at the very least, one person gets frozen out right away, and then the other two fight to the death. That's the general, thing, like the Mark Antony and Brutus. Everybody remember who the third member of the triumvirate was Brutus and Mark Antony? No, Pompey was the other earlier one.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, it was a guy named Lepidus, of whom in Shakespeare, Antony says, he's a tried. It says Lepidus. He's a tried and trusted soldier, and the future Augustus says, "So's my horse." That's how triumvirates go. Anyway, so this triumvirate was myself, the production manager, about a 6 foot, several inch, 300-something pound friend of mine named John Verporten, and a very good artist, mostly inker, named Frank Giacoya. Really, very good inker, one of the best curvy inkers for sure, very good artist. But an inker, never held an office job before, and so Stan named him assistant art director, which was funny because we had no art director. Stan didn't use the title, but he didn't want, and the production manager, that was fine. Stan was never wanting to be that. I was informed that I was going to be the story editor. And I said, I didn't want to be the story. That sounds like I just handled the scripts, and everything. And so Frank Giacoya becomes assistant art director, as I said. And that meant he was supposed to produce a lot of covers and talk to the artists, do all the stuff. And Frank was just a wonderful artist, but he was one of these guys. First day I ever met him, he was telling me how he'd seen Gunga Din 50 times. And that was always while he was inking. He never got anything done because he was always watching old movies on television. He was just, he was good, but he was good in a different way. He had now risen above what he could really do. I was really thinking of quitting. By then I had offers to go back to DC as a full editor if I wanted to, and I loved their characters, that Justice Society and all that. And I was really thinking about quitting. That would have startled Stan. He provokes me and I quit a few weeks later. And I went to my new friend, Gil Kane, the artist, who was a wonderfully talented autodidact who just had opinions on everything. And by the way, was a huge Howard fan, probably before I was born. And I told him, I said, I'm really just thinking of quit. I've been thinking of taking this DC job. He says, my boy. That's what he talked. Everybody was my boy, even people older than he. He says, my boy, because he's about 6 foot something. He looked at him. My boy says, don't do anything. It will all come to you. I said, what are you talking about? Don't compliment me. I got this unhappy situation. He says, just wait and see and keep your eyes open. It'll all change. So about a week or so goes by, and Stan calls me in, and he says, listen, I'm really unhappy. Frank he's not delivering enough covers. He's a good inker, but he just can't deliver these covers and this and that and so forth. And he says, you got to tell him this and that. I says, no, I can't do that, Stan. I could have, but I was telling him. I said, I couldn't do that. He says, why not? He says, well, I'm not his boss. I said, you divided it up into the three of us. He's my equal, just like the production manager is. So I can't tell him what to do. He says, oh, well, we got to change that. I said, well, if you insist, you know. So overnight, after a few weeks, I became editor-in-chief, and Frank quit in disgust and hated me forever, but, you know, I kept him fully employed. He kept talking, you know, it's just that he never quite understood that he was a wonderful artist and he should stay an artist, you know, and everything. And not that I was some wonderful editor, but I sort of knew my way around the office a little better. But that's, you know, it wasn't really intrigue. It's just, you know, life is what happens to you, as John Lennon used to say, while you're busy making other plans. And that's sort of the way my, you know, entire life has been. You know, I was supposed to be an Egyptologist at one point if I had enough money to go to college back in the early 60s. Then I accepted an offer to do graduate work at Washington University, George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I had a little fellowship from the Scottish Rite Lodge that I didn't belong to, it's just somebody got me. And 2 weeks later, I got a job offer to be the assistant editor of Superman, and I instantly threw over the fellowship in order to, you know, go into comic books because I thought it might be more fun. The idea of it being a long-term career had never occurred to me. After all, nobody over 10 read comic books, you know. But I figured it would be fun for a few years. It beat the hell out of high school teaching, which I hated. So that was it.
But once again, he plays this down because after Stan Lee, they always talk about two editors that had the most prosperous tenure, Roy Thomas and Jim Shooter. But Roy Thomas, that 3-year window, after Stan Lee creating the Marvel Universe, co-creating the Marvel Universe with Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and others, you know, those characters were so strong. But then you got the second generation of characters, that came out of Roy's tenure, which was, we all know today, just as well as Spider-Man, from Wolverine to Ghost Rider. Now these are characters he co-created, but there's also Shang-Chi. Look at all the movies now that's coming. A lot of them are all from his tenure that came out of that, and there's never been, after Roy, there's never been that many solid characters. You'll get one or two and all that stuff coming out of all these other people, but nothing like Roy and Stan's tenure. I mean, it's just amazing if you see everything that's in the pop culture and ruling the world today.
Well, we had to have books, you know. Stan, we kept they kept coming up with reasons why we had to have more comics, and you know, then Stan decided he wanted to get into the black and white comics. Some of you remember Creepy and Eerie and Vampirella and those things, and you know, Jim Warren, the publisher of those, just, you know, I think at one stage he had agreed to sponsor Stan into this group called the Friars Club. It was this entertainment thing. If Stan would promise never to compete with him in the black and white comics field, and Stan said yes and then double-crossed him, I guess, because next thing you know, we got a Conan book, and we got several horror books, Dracula Lives and this and that. The only one that really lasted was the Conan book, which lasted for, you know, 20, 30 years. But you know, and but it was all by the seat of our pants. Conan, as I described before, was by the seat of the pants. The readers told us to do it. Stan, you know, said look into it, and we lucked into the greatest of all the characters and everything when we didn't think that was possible. I'm probably lucky too. What if they had told me to create a character? I couldn't have created, neither could Stan, a character in Sword and Sorcery. It would have been anything to hold a candle to Conan, probably. So, you know, we're lucky that we ended up licensing a character. It was good for Conan, and it was good for Marvel and so forth. And eventually good for Dark Horse and Schwarzenegger and all these people.
And I don't know, and maybe some of you guys know this or not, but in What If 13, well, Roy was the hand in creating that series that's going to be an animated thing on Netflix, I think, or Disney, on Disney.
Disney Plus.
Disney Plus, but that Conan, and I think the best What If story ever, I hate to say, I hate to say this, I'm not even the biggest Conan fan, but What If 13, when Conan walked the earth, there's a reference in one of those panels, and when somebody sees Conan, what do they say? And this is in 1979.
I don't remember what he said. That's...
What did he say? Hey, Conan, you look like...
Oh, probably Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, look at that.
But of course, at that time, wasn't it that's the late 70s? That's before the Conan movie. Schwarzenegger was already, however, in line to play that ever since 1976. He'd been first approached about it in 1976, right about the time Conan. But it took from 76 to 82 to actually get the movie made. So I threw that in because I knew Schwarzenegger was going to be Conan if they got one made. Schwarzenegger actually appeared in, what was it, Conan #4 in an ad. There's right opposite pictures of Conan fighting that giant spider in #4, I think it is. There's a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger holding some girl up, you know, which in a way sort of
The Weeder ads, the Joe Weeder ads.
Yeah, because he was Mr. America and all that kind of stuff. And there's Arnold Schwarzenegger by name, his name listed in a Conan comic. So his association with Conan actually goes back to the very early 70s. He just didn't know it.
And here's something that people don't know about Roy and his editor-in-chief stuff, that after he left, there's a couple, there was Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, Jerry Conway. They were all trying to race each other who could get out of there the quickest. I don't know. They came in, got out, okay? And it started getting quicker and quicker.
Yeah, Archie lasted about a year or so.
But Roy Stan wanted Roy back. And a lot of people don't know that. Why don't you tell them the story about Stan wanting you back?
Well, it's not much of a story, but it just, well, you know, actually I was sort of quit and I sort of fired in 1974. You know, Stan and I, and in particular the other business people, it wasn't quite as much Stan, but the other guy who had now become the president of the company, because Stan didn't want to handle some of those business things. He decided I wasn't a team player, and you know, he's probably right. I mean, I'm a team player, you know, if I'm the captain of the team, or you know, or some co-captain like with Stan. You know, I don't mind being second man, but if it's just you know, we want to do this and you carry it out, which is what Stan had done years ago with Goodman too. I'm not real good at that. You know, and I wasn't good as a teacher, I wasn't good at it as a student, I wasn't good at it as an editor. So we gradually grew further and further apart because I would fight, and Stan said this in interviews later, right after I quit, even being, you know, politely, not being angry at me, but just saying, you know, Roy would fight too many of these things that I wanted to do. And, you know, at that stage, if somebody has to go, it's got to be me. And I was, you know, thinking of quitting, but I was gonna hang on. I'd been there 2 years and several months as editor-in-chief. And so then you know, finally something came up and everything, and Stan said, well, I guess this memo you wrote me should be your letter of resignation. I said, yeah, that's a good idea, you know. And so I was going to go over to D.C. again. Every time something happened, my fallback plan was I'll go back to D.C., you know, and everything, and they'll give me a better job than the last time, you know. And he said, no, I don't want you to go back to D.C. I want you to keep on working for Marvel. You know, we'll find somebody else. He didn't even have another editor-in-chief. He divided the job between Marv and Len. There wasn't an editor-in-chief for about 6 months. He divided it up because he said it was too big a job, which it was. And so he said, I just want you to be the writer. I said, no, I won't do that. He said, what do you mean? He said, I won't work for Len and Marv. I said, I love Len and Marv. They're great guys, talented guys. I hired them, you know, but I said, I won't work for them. I said, I'll work for you. I said, I want a writer and editor contract, so I'm my own editor, and they can't change a word, tell me what to do, choose my artist, nothing. I said, he says, well, that's kind of tricky because they might want to. I said, well, goodbye, you know. And he said, okay, well, so they did it, and so forth. So for the next several years I worked, and then when the next, about the fourth or fifth editor after me in about 2 years, Archie Goodwin, a very good editor who had been at Warren doing Creepy and Eerie, very nice guy, a year or two older than me. He decided after about a year and a half or so to leave, and they decided Stan decided I had mellowed. He talked to me, he decided I wasn't going to be Crusader Rabbit as much anymore as I was before, so he invited me to rejoin the thing, to come back and take the job, and you know, and I accepted, but as soon as I did it, I began to realize I didn't want that job. I didn't like it the first time. You know, I didn't get a chance to write as much. I didn't get a chance to do the things I wanted to do. I was too busy just approving covers and having conferences, and just, you know, it wasn't that much fun. It was more fun when Stan and I were working together and I was number 2. I didn't like being number 1, even though he was even higher. It just wasn't the same. So I accepted, and I said, so I went off to LA, visit a friend of mine for a week, because I knew I wasn't going to have, once they got the new contract ready, I wasn't going to have a vacation for a year or two. And I'm out there in February of '76, and it's the sun is shining. I'm walking around during the day in a short sleeve shirt, and I said, I ain't going back to New York. You know, I walked down the street and filth was flying in my eyes. I said, I've had it. You know, I love New York, but I'm not going back there anymore. So I came back and I told Stan, you know, that I'm afraid you'll have to tear up the contract and so forth, because I'm not, you know, coming back. And I just stayed around until 1980 for another several years as writer and editor, and then when I felt I was lied to about a new contract with the new editor, I quit. And I went to DC, and I hated that worse than I hated Marvel. So I came back, and I've done more work for Marvel, and I loved DC as a comic, but I never fit there somehow. By the time I got there, I was ruined for the DC corporate status, I think. But anyway, that's a very boring story. Let's have some questions or something.
All right, but before we do that, I was going to segue into your little trip into DC, but regardless whether he liked it or not, he makes some of these characters, he co-creates a few of them, and now they're starting to pop up in the DC movies that are coming. And what's interesting about that is, you know, you got all these other creators, a lot of his peers, they're either, a ton of them are in Marvel, or a lot of them are in DC. Roy seems the guy to be right on the fence, that he has all these characters in Marvel, but then he's got a lot of these prominent characters in DC. He's on both sides of the fence, and I find that that's surprising.
Well, they're not that prominent, but they get on television, because bless their hearts, that Stargirl show seems to be using a bunch, most of which Dan and I made up together, and they keep using them. They've changed them a lot, but they use them, and somehow they count us as, me anyway, as being the creator. I give her half the money anyway, don't worry. But you know, it's nice. But the funny thing is, if I had known, if I had even the tiniest bit of, you know, we all say this about different things. Well, actually, if I had the most precognition, I would have bought a bunch of copies of Action #1, you know, years ago. But if I had a little bit, what I would have done in those years that I was there, I would have created so many characters, you'd almost say Stan who. Because every time Stan looked around, I would have been trying to create a new character because I know that someday Marvel was going to pay me money because they put it in a movie or on television. But instead, I did the opposite. I knew I would really resent it if they made movies or television shows, toys, etc., out of characters that I co-created and I didn't get anything out of it, recognition and or money, but money first. And so therefore, I would try to create characters without creating characters. You had to make up some villains because you can't keep fighting Dr. Doom forever. But I would try, if instead of making up a new character, I'd make up a Black Knight that was sort of based on an old Marvel character called the Black Knight. Or I would make up even the Vision, one of the most famous
characters. Who's appearing in Eternals?
The Black Knight, will be in the Eternals movie coming up. Because somebody else, not me, made him a boyfriend of one of the Eternals. So now they've got one of the major parts of the movie is a character I made up, and I wrote the Eternals once, but I didn't make up any characters for it. But anyway, so, you know, even the Vision was an old character by Simon and Kirby that I revamped and turned into an android, and the android part was Stan's suggestion, so you probably get more credit than I deserve there. But eventually, it turned out that my name was on a lot of characters. A lot of time I didn't write them, like Wolverine. I just made up the name, and I said he's Canadian, he's short, and he's mean-tempered, you know, like a real Wolverine. And I gave it to Len Wein, one of the best comic writers, and he did everything else, and thought he created the character later. And actually, he co-created it. We all did. You know, usually you very seldom see these characters that. Sometimes there's one person created a character, like my friend Bill Everett created the Submariner back in 1939. Nobody else created the Submariner. Carl Burgess created the Human Torch, nobody else. But most of them was like, you know, it was either Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster who got credit for co-creating Superman, or it was Bob Kane who co-created Batman but stole all the credit, you know, and everything, and screwed the writer, Bill Finger. I mean, they think Stan screwed Jack Kirby. That's nothing to what Bob Kane did to Bill Finger. But anyway, so it was just a lot of fun, and, you know, and eventually, you know, it's delightful. Sometimes I like what they do with the characters that I co-created, or that Stan did for that matter. And sometimes I really hate them. The Conan movies, I loved Schwarzenegger, as I thought he was a pretty good Conan. But and the movie, that first movie was, you know, pretty fair, but it wasn't really Conan to me. It never has been, you know. And the second one, we weren't allowed to do what we wanted to do, so that didn't turn out even as well as the first one. So there's still never to me been a good Conan movie, but then I'm one of these guys that doesn't never think there's been a good Tarzan movie, and there's been about 5,000. Anyway, we have questions or something?
Okay, yeah, we're gonna go. Go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about the creation of Morbius, the living vampire with Gil Kane? It's always been one of my favorite characters.
Yeah, it's another one of these weird coincidences that it shouldn't have been me who had any hand in it. Thank goodness it was, you know. But if happy because of that. When the movie finally comes out, it's been sitting in the can for about a year or two now. But Morbius the Living Vampire, what happened is that, as many of you know, there was this thing I talked about last night, the comics code, which was the equivalent of the movie code they had for years. And one of the things it wouldn't do, along with various other things, was you could not use werewolves or vampires, you know, in any shape or form. You couldn't use the terms, you couldn't have anything. It didn't matter what the story was. Other things too. And so when, by 1971, by various things, they decided it was time to update the code. You know, the movies had changed. It was time to update the code. They knew they no longer had a readership that averaged out at 8 or 10 years old. The average comic reader was, you know, probably in his teens by that time. Now it's about 43, I think. But, you know, but at that time it was already well up in the teens at the very least, you know, because, and instead it set about in the early days. I've seen letters where he was talking about to Jerry Bales in 61, you know, where that 62, that we're trying to reach an older audience, you know, and everything. Sometime later he'd say, oh, no, I just write for myself. He knew what he was doing. But anyway, and he was aiming for an older audience then, and he quickly discovered he was getting it. So we wanted to do the vampire, but the code, when they changed this code, since they were such inept people, the code people, and they're trying to look good to all the PTAs all over the world. So they wrote this thing, it says, it's all right to use vampires and werewolves who are used in such works as Dracula and Frankenstein in high caliber works of art. It's high caliber, I mean, that's the phrase in there, high caliber. I don't know exactly what a high caliber work of art is. But anyway, so the funny thing was, of course, Morbius isn't a vampire, really. That's so we got to double cross the one on that. We shouldn't have been allowed to do it, really. So Stan was the writer of the first 100 issues of Amazing Spider-Man, the character he and Ditko created together. And, you know, but he decided he was going to go off and write a movie. He needed 3 or 4 months off from writing. He'd still come by and look at a few covers here and there, but he was taking a lighter hand, and I was expected to kind of, this is a year before I became editor-in-chief, but I was expected to kind of run the place editorially, you know, anything he didn't come in and do. And he said, I can't write Spider-Man. I said, well, he says, I can't write Spider-Man and Fantastic Four for 4 months. I says, good, I want to write Fantastic Four. That's my favorite comic. The Thing is my favorite Marvel character of all time, one of my favorite characters. Love that character. And he says, no. He says, you can only write one. You don't have time to write one. I said, yeah. He says, well, I want you to write Spider-Man. I says, but I don't want to write I love Spider-Man since the first, but I didn't want to write him. He's this teenage angst. I'd been writing X-Men. I'd had enough of that stuff. I didn't want to write on him with his girlfriends and his acne and all that stuff. I wanted to read it, but I didn't want to write it. But Stan says, write Spider-Man, so I did. And he said, well, first thing I want you to do is, they just changed the code, you can do vampires. I want you to put a vampire in it. So Gil Kane was the artist at that time. We said, okay, so we're going to put Dracula in it. We're just bring Dracula, you know, later became a Marvel book, it wasn't this. So we're going to just bring Dracula in. And said, well, you know, maybe we should do something with Dracula sometime. But no, I wanted to be like a super villain vampire. So, you know, Stan had a hand in the creation of Morbius, so I would, you know, never deny that. Because he said, do a super villain. And then after that, he went away. He never paid any attention to it. He read the story later, or looked over it. But and Gil and I decided, instead of making it a real vampire, you know, we were trying to do something. I said, well, I remember this movie I saw back in the late 50s. It was just called The Vampire, black and white BC film. But it's about a guy who had a blood disease. And because he had this blood disease, he has to drink blood in order to survive. So he becomes kind of like a vampire, but he's not, you know, Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee or something like that. And Gil liked that idea, so we plotted out this story and we did it, and that's how we had Morbius the living vampire, because he wasn't dead like the real vampires. And I wrote those first two stories, and Stan had left me with Spider-Man with extra 4 arms, so I had an 8-armed guy running around and so forth, you know, and that kind of took away from the whole story. But we had the 2 stories about Morbius, and I don't think I ever wrote the character again until I wrote it in Spider-Man script 20 or 30 years later. But, you know, so I just created the character, and then other people took it over. But I talked with Jay Lee, was it Leto?
Jared Leto.
Jared Leto. Yeah, he called from London when they were filming the movie, and the main thing he told me I thought was funny, and you can watch this when you see the movie, is he says, one thing is good. He says, I don't have to wear these fake teeth. It's because I just do the scenes and they'll add them digitally later. You know, I mean, Lugosi didn't ever put in false fangs, but Christopher Lee, you know, once in a while they'd switch to a close-up and there he is with these big false sharp teeth in there, you know. And but anyway, it really looks good. He looks just right as the character, and I'm sure it'll, you know, be a fairly sound like they were at least taking the spirit that we had in mind for Morbius. And if we could ever go out to the movies again, maybe we'll actually finally see that. I've been waiting for Morbius to come out, and Eternals with the Black Knight. I hear there's some other characters in it too.
Black Widow.
Yeah, and the Black Widow's coming out, and I created her, what was her husband, I don't know if he's the Red Guardian. So I've been waiting, but unfortunately there were this little thing called COVID, you know, for the last year or two. It's kind of slowed down everything.
All right. Got another question?
Roy, could you talk a little bit about kind of what happened with Conan the Destroyer movie?
Well, have you ever seen a train wreck? Yeah. Well, yeah.
Wait, before you say, my mother, she loves that movie. Even when it's...
Roger Ebert loved it. He's the only
My mom
critic I saw
loves
who
that
liked it
movie.
as well as the first one. Well, they made the first movie, and I was a consultant. I don't have a credit because it was, as I was telling somebody earlier, it wasn't in writing that I got a credit for advising Milius on the movies. And of course, as Sam Goldwyn once said, a verbal contract isn't worth the paper it's printed on. So, and that was very true in this case. So I tried to get a credit, but I couldn't get it. But I got paid. And how I got involved with the movie, I love the story better because it's about money, and I always love stories about money. It is that Ed Pressman, the original producer of the thing, of the Conan movies, was gonna make he had paid me, I'll just say it was like 10 grand. I don't, so forth. It wasn't, a fortune, but it was enough money to do some nice things with. And what became really 2 days of work. Once I wrote out a couple of memos for Milius, he decided he knew everything he needed to know. He read the stories, and I never heard from him again. I just cashed my check, and that was it. I went to see the movie at the premiere. That was it. But so maybe I didn't deserve any credit. I don't know. But anyway, so I had this 10 grand, and so forth. I spent it, and a year goes by. And one day, I have never heard from this producer, Ed Pressman, the very soft-spoken heir to the toy fortune, Pressman Toy Fortune. And he calls me up where Dan and I are living in South Hollywood, and he's phone with a soft voice. He says, Roy, says, how you doing? I said, Ed Pressman, never heard from him. I hadn't heard from him for ages. Had no business with him. He says, he starts to ask me what you're up to, and I said, well, my partner Jerry Conway and I, we'd written a movie called Fire and Ice that was sword and sorcery that was going to come out. We sold 2 or 3 others. They didn't end up getting made, but we made them. We were paid for them, working with Ralph Bakshi and a couple of other people. And he says, oh, that's very interesting. We're going to be starting the second Conan movie soon. You should come by and talk. So that's why I got invited. But obviously I could tell that's not why he called me. He did not call because he didn't know I had written a movie script or co-written one. And so I wait and I wait and I wait. And finally, after about 5 or 10 minutes, after he's got all the other stuff out of the way, we get to what I always think of as the Columbo moment, for those of you old enough to remember. The one where Columbo would get up and walk to the door and then turn around to the guy that he already suspected, if he didn't know had done the crime, and said, oh, by the way, one more thing, This was a by the way, it's the same, whatever variation of it. He says, by the way, he says, you remember that $10,000 I gave you for, paid you for being advisor? He says, oh yeah. I thought, I perk up, because maybe it's another deal, and to advise on the second movie. I says, well, Dino De Laurentiis, the Italian producer, is coming into a bigger way in the second picture, and he's got to repay me all the money that I paid out on the first movie. That's part of our deal. I said, well, that's great, okay. So why is he calling me about it? He says, well, I have a check here from Dino for $10,000. I said, yeah. He says, but it's made out to you. All of a sudden, the light goes off over my head. I know why Ed Pressman's calling. He's got a $10,000 check he wants to cash. And he can't because it's made out to me, and he thinks I can hold up and say, that's my check, or, I want a part of it, or somebody says, no, listen, I got my money. You send somebody down. I think the doorbell rang about 5 minutes later. It wasn't long, let me tell you. And he said, you bring it down, some minion he had sent out, and, I signed the check, and the guy zooms off on his motorbike or a car, or whatever it was. But in the meantime, I got invited to come in with my partner Jerry Conway, who wrote comics also and was very interested in screenwriters, and we've done several things together. And we ended up writing the first 4 or 5 drafts of the second Conan movie. But it got worse every time. Every time we went to a meeting, and they were all with Ed, not with Dino mostly, every time we went to a meeting, the budget was about $1 million or so less than the time before, and everything. He was going to try to make this for a fraction of what he had made. Instead of spending, the first movie was made where, remember? Where? Spain. Well, the second movie was made in Mexico. He was sort of, because he thought it would be cheaper, So, just everything was getting cheaper. Schwarzenegger was still in it, but everything was going downhill. He went through 2 or 3 different directors. We were the only people on this thing all the way through till near the end, because by the time the 3rd director came in, he finally got rid of it. so forth, after we'd written those 5 drafts. And Dan and I were remodeling our home in San Pedro, California, and every time a thing for a new draft would come in, I'd say, okay, call up the carpenter, and he can build the roof now, and that was sort of the way we financed the house, with 3 or 4 drafts of the thing and so forth. And it was a lot of fun working, but we, let's see, we had a director on there. I'm trying to remember his name. Do you remember his name? Yeah, the guy who directed. He directed.
Fleischer?
No, Fleischer's the final director. There was another guy who played Roger Donaldson. If you, he later directed Cocktail. Well, Roger Donaldson. He was an young Australian guy who had fled the draft by going to New Zealand. I guess it worked. And he became a filmmaker in New Zealand. He had done a picture called Smash Palace. It was a low budget picture. It got some buzz, and people thought he was a good director. So Dino De Laurentiis hires him, or maybe it was Pressman still, hires him to become the director in place and to work with us on the script. And we delivered a first draft we were very happy with. It's the only one we would ever show to anybody out of the several drafts we wrote. And it had a lot of his input, and it was a pretty good script. And so forth. And then Roger Donaldson's real proud of it. He goes off to have a meeting with Dino De Laurentiis, and I'm going to show him this script. It had a lot of stuff in it. Ideas he had put into it. And so I'm going to show him the script, and we're going to have our movie. And he goes in. We meet him a couple days later. He says, well, I got good news and bad news. Since the movie's going forward, but I won't be directing it. Dino met him, found out he was from Australia and New Zealand, and the first thing Dino says to him, he says, I'm remaking a movie about the mutiny on the Bounty. So, and I've got a ship down in New Zealand. All I need is a director. So he pulls him off he pulls this talented young guy off the Conan movie, and he shoves in somebody else for a little while. And then Richard Fleischer, who had directed some pretty good movies. I loved his 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea for Disney, and he directed The Vikings, that I hear was pretty good. I don't know if I ever saw it. But at this stage, he's in the twilight of his career by his own admission. He's just doing it for the paycheck, and so forth. He had very little enthusiasm. And we met with him once. We were doing what became our final draft. And, it was clear that this guy was just going to go through the motions, to make the money. And, he wasn't being maybe probably paid as much as he wanted to be, and he was about to retire. The only thing I gave him one of my comic books. I think the last issue of the run I did, number 115, in which Conan is trying to bring Belit back to life. He makes a deal with the sorcerer to bring Belit back to life if he does things for him. And Jerry and I wanted to make that part of the picture. So that'd be a good way, trying to bring the Valeria character who would take from the first movie back to life, and that would kind of tie it in and so forth, even though obviously it wasn't going to work. We had that kind of idea, and we loaned that. I gave my only spare copy of that comic to Richard Fleischer, and naturally I didn't get it back. In the several years I worked at Hollywood, I never got anything back that I ever loaned to a producer. But anyway, but the idea shows up in the movie. If you've seen the second movie, the idea is in there. He stole our idea, he just got rid of us, And then they tried to kick our names off the movie, because although the plot is pretty close to what we did, as my agent once said, he says, if you blink and turn down the sound, it's your movie. I said, yeah, but anyway, so, and the other thing we did, I was real proud of it, it's kind of funny, is we cast the female lead accidentally. Back when I was doing Conan the Barbarian comics, so you remember this, I created a black character named Zula, who had a kind of a mohawk haircut. I wanted a black, swordsman who was also a bit of a magician, in an illusionary sense. And so we had that name. So Jerry and I decided we were going to make up a female. We wanted a different character from Valeria, blonde Valeria, in the first movie. So he said, we're not going to have him fall in love with another sword woman right away, but let's get a character, who's. And we decided we'll have a black. We called her our Black Amazon, and because we didn't have a name right away, we used the name Zula, which can be masculine in a lot of African languages, but it sounds feminine to American ears. So Zula became the kind of the holding place name until we found a better one. But everybody liked Zula, so it stayed Zula. Now there were 2 Zulas in the Conan universe, a different word. And in the meantime, we had a meeting at Dino De Laurentiis' cabana. He had his whole little building he would rent, little house on the grounds of the Beverly Hills Hotel. And we would go there, and whenever Dino wasn't watching soccer on TV, he would take 5 or 10 minutes and talk to us about the movie. And whenever he wanted to go back to watching soccer, when something interesting happened, and I don't understand what interesting ever happened in soccer, but then we'd get a chance to talk to him if, in between. So we would finally do this, and he would give us these things, and we'd talk about our scripts. And we had the first scene we had a rat running across. I think he came from one of the Japanese directors' film, but it was a rat running across in front of a thief or something. And he says, and Dino says, "No rats!" I don't know, maybe when he was growing up in Italy, he saw a lot of rats. He didn't like, so there were no rats in the movie. That's just a rule. And of course, we had a priest, because we had to take off on one of the priests of the Rogues in the House story that Conan kills. And he says, "No priests." I guess his Catholic background, he thought that was bad. Everything we wanted to do, and another one, we had a wonderful scene where Conan's climbing a wall, and there are these leeches coming out of holes, and as the holes go higher, they're bigger and bigger, because the leeches were getting bigger and bigger, and he has to crawl up through there in one scene, because we couldn't do spiders, because another movie was doing spiders, And so anyway, so we do this, and then he sees it, he says, "No bloodsuckers." Actually, what he did, he started talking Spanish, and he had a translator, friend of his name was Fred Sidewater. Everybody called him Fred Sidewinder. But anyway, and finally he looks at us and says, "No bloodsuckers." We didn't know, we're in Hollywood, of course there are bloodsuckers, But he explains it, he means the leeches. I says, "We can't have the leeches," so we had to change that to something else, and so forth. And it was really depressing working with Dino. He was funny. It was an interesting character, but it was just no fun to work with him. And the movie didn't turn out nearly as. Then he took us off, and he went through. He put a writer who had written some very good movies, Stanley Mann. I remember he'd written the screenplay to The Mouse That Roared and a few other movies I'd really liked, an English writer. And he delivered a journeyman-like script. But the the way we cast Zula was, we were sitting at the Cabana finally, and we get a casting person in there, a young woman, one of the most prominent casting people in Hollywood at the time. And we're sitting at the table, Jerry, me across the other, Dino, and the casting person, Jane. And he's talking, he says, "We haven't got the final script yet," obviously, because Jerry and I are still on it, "We haven't got the script yet, we don't really have a director, but we've got to hire the main characters, So, and Zula, he says, "Zula, yeah, I'm thinking about going Asian with her." And Jerry and I, oh God, we spent like several drafts creating this black Amazon. He's going to turn her into Asian, but nothing wrong with. But we created her to be Zula, and we make that a third movie, And so ordinarily we never said that. You never talked back to Dino. He was not one of those people who wanted to hear, maybe, let alone no. But so, and it was Jerry actually who turned to the casting person, and. One of the first times we probably had talked directly to her and said, "Well, we were thinking of somebody more like Grace Jones." He and I had been discussing. I'd never heard her song, but I'd seen just pictures of her. She looked right, and Jerry had seen a couple of things, and we just thought she looked right, and so forth. So yeah, and so I sort of chimed in, and Dino was kind of sitting there fuming, and she sparked to it and says, "Oh yeah, I'll get in touch." And of course, then she went on to a Bond picture and a few other movies and so forth. And she never knew how she got her start. Was just us sitting there and ignoring the producer and talking to the casting person, Jane Feinberg, about this. But so those are how things go right and they go wrong. And if the movie wasn't very good, I think our version would have been better, but it probably wouldn't have been that good either. I don't think it would have been allowed to be any good. Anyway, that's the story of Conan the Destroyer, which got destroyed, And that's why there wasn't a Conan 3, I suppose, for quite a few years.
I liked it. Okay.
I like Grace Jones. She was great. Oh, and I have to say, since I've been bad-mouthing the director and to some extent Trina a little bit, I have to say the best scene in the movie, to me, is the introduction of Zula, if you've seen it. That's really good. It's where Conan comes into a village and Zula is like tethered by one leg for some thing she's done, and the villagers are going to kill her, and she's fighting against him, and Schwarzenegger, Conan wants to watch to see if she's worth saving, and so forth. And that's entirely, Fleischer and Stanley Mann, the best scene in the movie, so I want to give them credit for that. But everything else is the plot Jerry and I made up with new dialogue, basically, and just enough changes. The reason there's new dialogue is this system that Hollywood has. The more you write somebody, the more you can claim credit. See, and the idea was the writer who took over from us, naturally, I would have done the same thing if I had been him, he wanted to get it to the point where he could have the only credit on the movie. You know, we had to fight for the credit that said to be story by Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway. They wanted to wipe us out. And that's the last story I'll tell about this movie, because it's the weirdest, is that right at the end, we had to go to arbitration with the Writers Guild. You know, they decide, not the producer, not the director, but the Writers Guild of America, which Stanley Mann and Jared and I were all members. They look at all the drafts, our 5 drafts, the 3 or 4 that he did, and they compare, and we write in why we think we should get the rights and show this and that, and he does that. They take a few weeks. When they finally got this, the movie was already very close to coming out. They'd done prints, and so we won. No, we didn't win to get any full credit on the thing, but we got a full story credit. It's a full screen. It was very nice to have. Would do us some good. And so we got a call from Dino's guy, Fred Sidewinder again, and he says, Dino, you know, realize you won, and you're gonna get the money, and you're gonna get the money from, you know, video sales, this, that, whatever. But, you know, we've already got the movie kind of, you know, it's already, the prints are being made and this and that. It's gonna cost us a lot of money to do a new credit, insert your separate credit. So we will pay you, I can't remember if it's, you know, 5, 10 grand a piece, if you will, or whatever it was, if you will, and you won't suffer any other way. Your name just won't be on the movie if you will just, you know, let us do the movie as this without adding your credit. And we took about 3 seconds and we just laughed over the phone and said, you change the credits. You know, we just, you know, cheerfully passed on the money. We'd rather have the credit. So if nothing else, it was one last way of giving Dino Laurentiis the finger, you know.
Do we have another question?
We have finished in a minute, but it's the last question or two, maybe. Not?
No more? Okay, so what we're gonna start doing is we're gonna start taking, you know, if you have, we're gonna do what we did yesterday and taking, you know, autographs for
I thought
Roy
that
and
was at
stuff.
1.
What?
I thought that was at 1. That's a
Oh, is that
we
at
don't go
1?
right into it, yes.
Break for lunch here.
Oh,
Break for
okay.
lunch, all right, so I guess we'll break for lunch. Thank you very, and something I should have done last night at the banquet, and I should have done, my wife reminds me, sometimes I forget my manners. They're not all here, but Rusty will have to pass on. I just wanted to thank Rusty and the Project Pride people and everybody for, you know, bringing us down here, and for actually for everything they do. You know, the years we're not here too, you know, all the stuff with the keeping Robert E. Howard's name alive, preserving the that house and all the various things, and making sense from a town where nobody knew that Robert E. Howard had ever lived here to a place that has his name in, you know, big letters on the side of the local library, you know, and so forth. And I think you guys deserve a lot of, you know, credit for that. And
That's awesome.
It's,
Yeah.
it's just great. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Woo! And you gotta, and the other thing is like, how astonished would Robert E. Howard be if
Yeah.
he knew
Yeah.
all those years ago that
He wouldn't be alive anymore now, but I wish he hadn't lived long enough to see, you know, to see the success of the paperbacks. I don't even know if he'd liked the comics. Even Glenn Lord didn't really like the comics. He just, you know, they weren't his thing, but he just understood they were useful, and we got along fine. But, you know, just think if he was allowed at least in the 60s and the 70s and see some money coming in and so forth. You know, I don't think he was enough of a Philistine, a purist that he would have turned down money for things like that. Some people would, you know, but I think he would have said, this is good, you know, a little extra money, I'll, you know, pay another one of my mother's hospital bills.
And Rusty, you give a great tour. One more time for Rusty.
Thank you.
And Roy Thomas.
Thank you very much.